The real story. Horror. Only. At Mr. Scare.
The thing about being a delivery driver is that you never know what kind of night you're going to have. Some nights it's quick drop-offs and good tips. Other nights you get lost on back roads, deal with vague instructions, or deliver to apartments with 10 identical buildings. I always liked working the night shift. The quiet streets, the glow of porch lights, the occasional thank you text from a customer. It felt peaceful in a way. But there was one delivery, just one, that broke that peace and left me questioning everything about what I'd seen that night. It was a Thursday in late November, a little past 10 p.m. The kind of night where the world feels a little emptier than usual. I had just finished a delivery when the app pinged with a new order. Package delivery, 123 Meadow Lane. Nothing about it stood out at first. The instructions were simple. Leave at the door. The route wasn't too far, though it was in a part of town I didn't recognize. One of those neighborhoods that feels forgotten, tucked behind overgrown lots and dark, narrow streets. I accepted the job without hesitation. I should have hesitated. The drive to Meadow Lane was uneventful at first. My car's headlights cut through the quiet, deserted streets as I hummed along to the radio. But as I got closer to the address, the houses became fewer and farther between. Eventually, I realized there was only one house left on the road, number 123. It was an old two-story home with peeling paint and dark windows. No porch light, no decorations, just a house that seemed to sit in silence, watching the road. I pulled into the driveway and checked the order details again. Leave at the door, it said. Simple enough. The package itself was odd. It was heavy for its size, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Something about it felt off, like it shouldn't be in my hands. But I shook the thought away, grabbed the package and stepped out of the car. The air was colder here, sharper. My breath came out in visible puffs as I walked up to the front door. The house felt wrong, the kind of wrong you can't put into words. The windows reflected nothing but darkness, and the door looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Still, I placed the package on the doormat, snapped a photo for proof of delivery, and turned to leave. That's when I noticed it. The door wasn't fully closed anymore. It wasn't open enough to see inside, just a crack, wide enough to make me stop in my tracks. Had it been like that before? No, I was sure I'd seen it shut. As I stared at the door, a sound broke the silence. "Wait." The voice was low, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere inside the house. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. Maybe it was the wind. Or maybe someone was home. Someone who didn't want their package left outside. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. No response. I took a cautious step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn away, the voice came again. "Come back." It wasn't loud, but it felt close, closer than it should have been. The kind of voice that doesn't just reach your ears, but settles deep in your chest. I didn't wait to hear it a third time. I hurried back to my car, fumbling with my keys as I climbed in and locked the doors. But as I started the engine, my phone buzzed. A new notification from the delivery app. "Customer has updated instructions. Bring package inside." No, absolutely not. There was no way I was going back to that house. I was about to ignore the message and drive off when the porch light flickered on. For the first time, the house looked alive. A faint glow illuminated the doorway, and I could just make out the edges of the package still sitting where I'd left it. I stared at it, torn between my gut telling me to leave and the growing sense that I was being watched. My phone buzzed again. "Please bring the package inside." I glanced at the windows. They were still dark, but I swore I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows just beyond the glass. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. But against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The cold bit harder this time, the kind that chills you to your bones. I picked up the package and walked back to the door. "Hello?" I called again, pushing the door open slightly with my foot. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing an empty hallway with peeling wallpaper and a staircase leading to the second floor. "Anyone here?" I asked, my voice echoing unnaturally. "Nothing." I set the package just inside the door and turned to leave, but something made me pause. At the end of the hallway, in the faint glow of my flashlight, a shadow moved. It wasn't the kind of shadow cast by furniture or a trick of the light. It moved deliberately, shifting along the wall before disappearing into the stairwell. I bolted out of the house, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath came in short gasps as I climbed into my car and peeled out of the driveway. But as I reached the end of the road, my phone buzzed again. "Thank you for delivering." That wasn't the strange part. The strange part was the timestamp. The message had been sent an hour before I'd even arrived. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow in the hallway and heard that voice, low and deliberate. "Wait." The next day I checked the delivery app. The order was gone. No record of it in my history, no trace of Meadow Lane or the customer. I tried looking up the address, but it didn't exist. There was no 123 Meadow Lane. Months passed, and I did my best to forget about that night. But every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about the package, the voice, the shadow in the hall. One night, as I was finishing a shift, my phone buzzed with a notification. "New delivery request, 123 Meadow Lane." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I didn't accept the order, but as I drove home, my headlights caught something on the side of the road, a package wrapped in plain brown paper, sitting in the snow. And for a moment, just before I sped away, I swore I heard it again. "Wait." They always say, never accept a delivery without knowing the sender. I used to laugh it off. After all, as a delivery driver, my job was simple. Grab the package, drop it off, and move on. That was until one night when a job came through that changed everything. It was nearing 11 p.m. on a Friday, my second to last delivery before clocking out. I had been working extra hours to save up for my kid's birthday party, so when my dispatcher called in with another urgent job, I didn't think twice.
"Got a last-minute priority for you, Mike,"
said the dispatcher, his voice unusually tense.
"Address is out of the way, but they're paying extra. Package is in Locker 7.
Locker 7 wasn't typically used. It was old and creaky, tucked in a dimly lit corner of the warehouse. When I opened it, the package inside was wrapped in an old burlap sack tied with fraying string. A faint odor wafted from it, something metallic and earthy, like rusted iron. The address was unfamiliar, 217 Ashgrove Lane. I plugged it into my GPS, but the route seemed odd, taking me through roads I'd never seen, despite working this area for years. Shrugging it off, I loaded the package and started driving. The first hour passed uneventfully, but the roads became increasingly narrow and overgrown. Trees arched over the path, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. My headlights barely cut through the dense fog that had settled in. Then my GPS began glitching. The map zoomed in and out erratically, the voice command sputtering nonsense. I was about to turn back when I spotted a sign for Ashgrove Lane, the paint faded and peeling. Against my better judgment, I followed it. Ashgrove Lane was little more than a dirt path, riddled with potholes and lined with trees so dense they seemed to press in on my van. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and an unnatural stillness settled around me. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. Finally, the house came into view. a crumbling Victorian mansion with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. The porch light flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow on the overgrown yard. My gut told me to leave the package on the porch and go, but company policy required a signature for priority deliveries. I grabbed the package and approached the door. It was massive, carved with strange symbols that made my skin crawl. Before I could knock, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. A figure stood at the far end, shrouded in shadow. "Delivery for 217 Ashgrove Lane?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The figure nodded, but didn't move. Hesitant, I stepped inside, the air growing colder with each step. I extended the package toward them, but they made no move to take it. "Sign here," I said, holding out the scanner. Their hand emerged from the shadows, long and pale with claw-like fingers. They scratched their name onto the screen, an illegible scrawl that sent a shiver down my spine. I set the package on the floor and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut before I could reach it.
"Thank you for bringing it back,"
the figure whispered, their voice layered as if multiple people were speaking at once. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The package was gone. Panic surged through me as I banged on the door, shouting for help. Suddenly, the house groaned, the walls shifting as if the entire structure were alive. Shadows crawled along the floor and walls, converging toward me. The whispers started then, low and unintelligible at first, but growing louder and more insistent. They came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in my skull. My head throbbed as the voices became clearer, each one accusing me of sins I didn't remember committing. Desperate, I bolted down the hallway, searching for an exit. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, the layout changing with every turn. Doors led to empty rooms, windows revealed only darkness. I was trapped. Then I saw it, a mirror at the end of the hall, its surface shimmering like water. The whispers urged me toward it, promising escape. With no other options, I lunged at the glass, expecting it to shatter. Instead, I fell through. I woke up in my van, parked in an empty lot. The clock on the dashboard read 3:33 a.m., though it had been just before midnight when I arrived at Ashgrove Lane. The package was no longer in the back, and my scanner showed no record of the delivery. I tried to report the incident to my dispatcher, but he claimed there was no priority delivery that night. The address for Ashgrove Lane didn't exist on any map. My coworkers laughed it off, saying I must have been overtired. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, when I'm out on late-night deliveries, I'll catch glimpses of the house in my rearview mirror, no matter where I am. And the whispers? They haven't stopped. They're with me, growing louder every night, waiting for the moment I finally understand what they've been saying. I fear that next time, I won't wake up in my van. I'll wake up back in that house, and this time, there will be no escape. I've been a delivery driver for a couple of years now. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills, and I actually enjoy the quiet drives through the city at night. Most shifts are routine: pick up, drop off, repeat. But sometimes you get that one delivery that makes you reconsider everything. It was a Tuesday night, late. I'd just finished my second-to-last drop when a new order popped up on the app. The pickup location was a small, hole-in-the-wall diner I'd never heard of before, Cliffside Eats. What caught my attention wasn't the location, but the fact that the diner was listed as closed. The payout was unusually high for a single delivery. Easy money, I thought, shrugging it off. But as I accepted the order and headed to the address, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The GPS led me to the outskirts of town, where the buildings thinned out and the streets grew darker. Cliffside Eats was perched precariously on the edge of a steep ravine, the diner's neon sign buzzing faintly in the cold night air. It looked abandoned. The windows were grimy, the paint peeling off the walls, and there wasn't a single car in the parking lot. I checked the app again. Pick up, Cliffside Eats. The front door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the diner was eerily clean. The tables were set with spotless silverware, the booths looked freshly wiped, and a faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. But there were no customers. Behind the counter stood a man in a pristine white uniform. His back was turned to me, and he seemed to be chopping something on a cutting board. Hi, I called out. I'm here for a pickup? The man froze, his knife stopping mid-chop. Slowly he turned around, revealing a face that was unsettlingly calm. His eyes were too wide, his smile too perfect.
Of course.
He said, his voice smooth but hollow. He reached under the counter and produced a brown paper bag, sealed tightly with tape.
Here you go.
He said, handing it to me. What's in it? I asked, half joking. The man's smile didn't falter.
It's better if you don't know.
The bag felt heavier than it should have. I glanced at the delivery address, Riverside Memorial Cemetery. My stomach turned. I'd heard of drivers being sent to strange places before, abandoned lots, empty fields, but a cemetery at this hour? Still, the payout was hard to ignore, and curiosity kept me going. The roads grew quieter as I approached the cemetery gates, a pair of wrought iron monstrosities that creaked open as if welcoming me in. Fog clung to the ground, and the air was unnaturally cold. I pulled the car to a stop near the marked pin on my app. The spot was deep within the cemetery, a clearing surrounded by headstones. My headlights illuminated rows of graves, their shadows stretching into the mist. I turned off the engine, gripping the bag tightly as I stepped out. My footsteps crunched against the gravel, each one sounding louder than the last. There was no one around, no sign of another living soul. Hello? I called, my voice echoing. The app pinged with a message. Leave the delivery at plot 173 and confirm completion. Plot 173 was just a few steps away, marked by a plain headstone with no name, only the words, awaiting reunion. I crouched to place the bag on the grave, my hands trembling slightly. As soon as the bag touched the ground, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, and a low hum resonated through the cemetery. I spun around, scanning for movement, but all I saw were the same headstones, the same shadows. Then I heard it, a faint whisper.
Thank you.
I froze. The whisper came from behind me. Slowly I turned back toward the grave, only to see the bag gone. The earth beneath it looked undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. Panic surged. I rushed back to my car, fumbling with the keys. As I started the engine, my phone buzzed. It was the app again. Delivery complete. Tip added. The payout flashed on the screen, triple the amount initially promised. Relief was short-lived as my rearview mirror caught movement. A figure stood in the distance, its form barely visible through the fog. It wasn't moving, just watching. I didn't take any more deliveries that night. Back at home, I tried to shake the experience off as a prank, a weird coincidence. But the next morning, a package was waiting on my doorstep. Inside was the same brown paper bag, sealed just like before. A note lay on top. We appreciate your service. Until next time. I didn't open the bag. Instead, I drove straight to a remote bridge and threw it into the river. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The app still works, though I've deleted it a dozen times. Orders come in, always from Cliffside Eats, always to strange, remote locations. And every time, I hear the whisper in my dreams. Thank you. But it's not gratitude. It's a warning. Months have passed, but the memories haven't faded. If anything, they've grown sharper, more intrusive. The app stopped sending notifications, but it didn't matter. I'd quit driving altogether. I moved to a new city, took up a day job, and tried to forget. But forgetting was impossible. It started small. The same bag reappearing, no matter how many times I tried to get rid of it. First on my doorstep, then inside my car, and finally, in places it couldn't logically be, like my locked bedroom. And then came the voices. They whispered at the edges of my hearing, in languages I didn't recognize. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they laughed. But the worst were the nights I woke up to silence, the kind that pressed against my chest like an invisible weight, only to realize I wasn't alone. Shadows danced in the corners of the room, just out of sight, as if waiting for something. One evening, I received a letter, handwritten, in ink so dark it looked wet. The fare is not yet paid. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. I shredded the letter, burned it, and threw the ashes into the wind. But later that night, my phone buzzed. The app was back. The icon glowed faintly on my screen, though my phone was off. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone, I opened it. A single order awaited. Final delivery. The pickup? My own address. The destination? To be determined. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. I wanted to run, but I knew it was pointless. Wherever I went, it would follow. The whispers had already started again, low and insistent, threading through the walls, the floor, the very air. With no other choice, I got in the car and began driving. The app's navigation took me down roads I didn't recognize, twisting paths through dense forest, over bridges I was certain didn't exist, and finally to a place where the horizon dissolved into nothingness. There was no turning back. I stopped the car, stepped out, and stood before a towering gate. It wasn't wrought iron like the cemeteries, but something older, made of bone and shadow, humming with an otherworldly energy. The whispers became a roar, words forming for the first time.
Every driver has their route. Every fare has its price. Now finish the journey.
I stepped through the gate, leaving the car and everything else behind. People still talk about the strange disappearance of a local delivery driver, though the story has faded into urban legend. But late at night, when the roads are empty and the world feels a little thinner, some drivers swear they see a car, old, rusted, its headlights dim. It always seems to be heading toward the cemetery, a solitary figure behind the wheel. And if you're unlucky enough to get an order from Cliffside Eats, don't accept it. No matter how much the payout is, no matter how curious you are, because once you take that first delivery, there's no going back. I know this now. After all, I'm the one making the deliveries. Delivering packages at night was supposed to be a simple job. No traffic, no supervisors breathing down your neck, just me and the road. But some nights felt different, like the shadows themselves had weight and presence, watching from the corners of my headlights. That night started innocently enough. My route was nearly complete, save for one last delivery to an address on the outskirts of the city, at the edge of a dense forest. The GPS directions seemed straightforward, though I'd never been to that part of town before. As I drove, the cityscape faded into silence. Streetlights grew sparse, and the hum of civilization gave way to the whisper of wind through the trees. The asphalt turned to cracked gravel, and the radio sputtered with static. The further I went, the heavier the air became, as if the darkness itself was pressing down on me. Then I saw her. A pale figure stood on the side of the road, barefoot and shivering in a tattered white dress. Her dark hair clung to her face, damp from the mist that seemed to rise from the ground. She wasn't waving for help, nor did she try to flag me down. She just stood there, staring at the van as I approached. I pulled over, heart pounding. "Are you okay?" I called out through the open window. Her eyes, wide and glassy, locked onto mine. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, almost mechanically, she nodded.
"I got lost,"
she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper.
"Can you help me?"
Every instinct screamed at me to drive away, but I couldn't leave her there. Something about her felt wrong, but the human part of me overruled the fear. I opened the passenger door, and she climbed in without a word. Her presence chilled the air inside the van. "Where are you heading?" I asked, trying to sound calm.
"Anywhere but here."
She whispered, clutching her arms, as if to stop herself from falling apart. The GPS began to glitch, the screen flickering before it went completely blank. "Great," I muttered, tapping the screen.
It's not the GPS.
She said, her voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the hum of the van.
They're coming.
I turned to her, my pulse quickening. "Who's coming?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stared out the windshield, her face pale and taut with fear. The headlights flickered, and for a split second, the road ahead was filled with shadowy figures. They were motionless, their forms indistinct but menacing. Then the light steadied, and the road was empty again. "What the hell was that?" I asked, gripping the wheel tighter.
They are hunting.
She replied, her voice trembling. The van sputtered and lurched to a stop, the engine dying with a final, guttural groan. I twisted the key, but it wouldn't restart. Outside, the forest seemed to shift, the shadows deepening. That's when I saw them. Figures emerging from the trees. Their movements were wrong, jerky, and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by a clumsy hand.
Run!
The girl screamed, throwing the door open and bolting into the woods. I hesitated for only a moment before following her. The darkness swallowed us, the forest alive with the sound of snapping branches and the rustle of unseen things.
They want me,
She said, her breath coming in ragged gasps.
but they'll take you too.
We stumbled into a clearing dominated by an ancient well. Its stones were covered in glowing, pulsating symbols that seemed to hum with a life of their own. "What do we do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. She turned to me, tears streaming down her face.
I'm sorry.
She whispered. Before I could react, she shoved me into the well. I hit the bottom hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. The darkness was suffocating, but a faint light began to emanate from the walls. The symbols etched into the stone writhed like living things, their glow pulsing in time with my frantic heartbeat. I wasn't alone. A man stood at the edge of the light, his face pale and gaunt. His uniform was identical to mine, though faded and tattered.
Welcome.
He said, his voice hollow and detached. "What is this place?" I demanded, scrambling to my feet.
The in-between,
He replied.
a trap. The girl brought you here, didn't she?
She needed help, I said, anger mixing with my fear. He shook his head.
She's their bait. She was like us once, tricked, trapped, and now, something else.
The light grew brighter, revealing more figures in the shadows. They wore delivery uniforms like mine, their faces blank and lifeless. "What do they want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper.
They feed on us,
He said.
our fear, our despair. Every time one of us falls into the well, they grow stronger.
The symbols on the walls flared, and the figures began to move, their heads snapping toward me in unison.
Run!
The man said urgently.
Before they take you too.
I ran the walls of the well, stretching and twisting as if alive. The air grew colder, and the sound of footsteps echoed closer and closer. I burst into a cavern, its walls lined with more glowing symbols. In the center stood the girl, her eyes glowing faintly.
You weren't supposed to come back.
She said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "What are you?" I demanded, my fear giving way to anger.
I was like you once,
She said softly.
but now I'm theirs, and soon you will be too.
The figures emerged from the shadows, their lifeless faces filling the cavern. Desperation took hold. I reached out, tracing one of the glowing symbols. The cavern trembled, and the figures hesitated, their movements jerky and uncertain.
You can break the cycle.
The girl's voice echoed in my mind.
Destroy the well.
The light grew blinding as I traced more symbols. The figures screamed, their voices shattering the air, and then silence. I woke on the roadside, the van idling nearby. The package sat on the seat, unopened. When I delivered it, the man who answered the door stared at me with wide eyes.
You're lucky to be alive.
He said.
Most don't come back.
As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. She was there, her glowing eyes meeting mine.
You'll have to return.
She whispered.
They never let anyone go for long.
I used to think ghost stories were just that, stories. something to scare kids or pass the time on long, quiet nights. But now, after everything, I know better. The first piece of the puzzle came from her. Lila, that strange girl I picked up on the roadside, wasn't just some random victim. Her story began long before she crossed my path. Her name was Lila, a regular teenager from a small, quiet town skirting the edge of the forest. Everyone knew about the old well, an overgrown relic of the past, whispered about in hushed tones. The stories were chilling: cursed travelers, eerie lights on moonless nights, and strange disappearances. Most dismissed them as folklore, but not Lila. She was curious. One fateful evening, while walking home from a friend's house, she heard faint cries for help coming from the woods. Against her better judgment, she stepped off the path, venturing into the shadowed trees. The cries led her to the ancient well, shrouded in moss and tangled vines. The moment she leaned over the edge, everything changed. A skeletal hand, cold and unyielding, shot out of the darkness and dragged her down. Inside the well, time unraveled. Days stretched into endless years, her memories dissolving into an abyss of despair. She wasn't alone. Others were there too, their faces pale and hollow, their voices echoing with anguish. The well fed on them, twisting their humanity into something monstrous. Lila fought to hold on, but eventually the well broke her. When she emerged, she wasn't herself anymore. She had become bait, a lure to drag more victims into the darkness. But a fragment of her humanity lingered, whispering for freedom, waiting for someone to break the cycle. Lila wasn't just a victim of the well, she was its prisoner, its pawn. Her story haunted me long after that night, but something she said before the end lingered in my mind.
You weren't supposed to come back.
I couldn't let it go. Who or what was controlling her? Why was the well at the center of it all? I needed answers. I started digging through old records, folklore, anything that could give me a clue about what I'd stumbled into. The deeper I looked, the more I realized Lila's tragedy was just the surface of something much darker. What I uncovered was a history soaked in blood, fear, and ancient power. The well wasn't just cursed, it was created for a purpose, one that had been feeding on people like me for centuries. When I first looked down that cursed well, I thought it was just an ordinary trap, some supernatural prison that had always been that way. But the truth is far older, darker, and crueler than I imagined. Centuries ago, the well wasn't a place of horror. It was a sacred site for a forgotten village, a beacon of healing and hope. Pilgrims came from all over to drink from its water, said to cure ailments and extend life. But prosperity always draws envy. During a brutal war, invaders desecrated the village, slaughtering its people and defiling the well. In their desperation, villages performed a dark ritual, hoping to summon a creature from another realm to grant them victory. They succeeded, but at a terrible cost. The entity they summoned was beyond their control. It consumed the invaders, the villagers, and even the land itself, binding its essence to the well. The last surviving shaman carved symbols into the stones in a futile attempt to contain the entity's power. But the containment was flawed, and over centuries, the symbols began to fade. Now the entity reaches out, drawing the desperate and the lost into its grasp. Each soul it devours strengthens its power, spreading its curse through the surrounding forest. The whispered tales, the cries in the night, they're all part of its sinister web. It didn't take long for me to realize that Lila wasn't just a victim. She was part of the well, connected to its darkness in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. But she wasn't like the others trapped there. She still had fragments of herself, memories that refused to fade. Lila's connection to the well allowed her to understand the glowing symbols etched into its stones. They weren't just decorations. They were the key. Over centuries, she had tried to guide others to break the curse, but the entity was always one step ahead, using her as both bait and betrayer. When I looked into her glowing eyes that night, I saw a spark of desperation. She didn't want to trap me. She wanted me to succeed where so many others had failed. Back to reality, after escaping the well, I couldn't let it go. The symbols haunted my dreams, twisting and pulsing like living things. And then there was Lila. She didn't leave me. Not really. Her voice came to me in the quiet moments, a whisper on the edge of sleep.
You can end this.
She said one night, her voice trembling.
But you'll need to go back.
My search led me to an ancient journal, hidden in the archives of a dusty, long-forgotten section of the local library. The librarian seemed almost reluctant to hand it over, her face tightening when I mentioned the well. She muttered something under her breath, something about disturbing things that should stay buried. But I was too desperate for answers to care. The journal was bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. It was written by a shaman who had lived centuries ago, someone who had been the last survivor of a village that once thrived near the forest. The language was archaic, full of strange symbols and cryptic phrases. But as I studied it, the pieces began to fall into place. The shaman had written of a terrible night when invaders desecrated the village. The villagers were forced to do something they did not want to do. Using forbidden magic, they summoned something from beyond, a being of shadow and hunger. It had erupted from the well, consuming everything in its path. The shaman, the only one left alive, had fought to seal the entity, carving protective wards into the stones with trembling hands. But even he knew it was a temporary solution. The entity's power was vast, and over time, the wards would weaken. Then I found it, the ritual. The shaman had documented a way to destroy the well and the entity within it, but his tone grew darker as he described the steps. It wasn't a simple act of sealing or banishment. It required fire to purify the wards, the precise tracing of the ancient symbols, and blood to bind the ritual together. But not just any blood. It had to be the blood of someone touched by the curse. Someone like me. The more I read, the more the weight of what I had to do began to settle over me. The shaman had warned that the entity would resist with all its power, using illusions, fear, and even my own memories against me. It wouldn't just stand by and let me destroy it, and even if I succeeded, there was no guarantee I'd survive. The final pages of the journal were stained and difficult to read, but one line was unmistakable, scrawled in bold, jagged strokes, as if the shaman had written it with his last breath.
Only through sacrifice can the well be unmade. Only through blood can the curse be broken.
I stared at the words, my mind racing. Could I really go through with it? The thought of facing that thing again, of stepping into the darkness it called home, made my blood run cold. But as I closed the journal, I realized I had no choice. If I didn't stop it, more people would be dragged into its grasp, trapped in the endless torment that Lila had endured. The ritual wasn't just a way to destroy the well, it was a battle for my soul, and the odds were stacked against me. This time I decided to come back. Standing at the edge of the forest, the journal's instructions burned into my mind. I couldn't deny the fear gripping me. This time, Lila didn't try to stop me. She was there, a pale silhouette among the trees, silently guiding me to the cavern's heart. The entity's true form was a writhing mass of shadows and faces, their mouths screaming silently as they emerged and dissolved into the darkness. The symbols glowed faintly on the cavern walls, flickering as if resisting the entity's power. Performing the ritual was like wading through nightmares. The entity lashed out, conjuring illusions of my family, whispering promises of freedom and power. But I kept going, tracing the symbols with fire and reciting the shaman's words. Lila fought alongside me, her flickering form shielding me from the worst of the entity's attacks.
You can't save me.
She said, her voice breaking.
But you can end this.
I hesitated for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Then I completed the ritual. The cavern shook violently as the symbols flared with blinding light. The entity screamed, its voice shaking the very air. Lila turned to me one last time, her face softening into something almost human.
Thank you.
she said before fading into the light. I woke up at the edge of the forest, the van idling nearby. The package was still on the seat, unopened, but the well was gone. In its place was a crater, its edges lined with ash. The forest felt lighter, the air easier to breathe, but I knew the cost. Lila's face stayed with me, a reminder of everything she had endured. Sometimes late at night, I hear her voice again, soft, fleeting, like a breeze through the trees.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Please hit follow to support the channel, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. See you soon, and goodbye.